The box was wrapped in silver paper I never kept in the house, tied with a ribbon I didn't recognize, and the card simply said, "For the nights you said you missed me," in handwriting that wasn't mine. I stood there in the kitchen, the afternoon light hitting the granite countertop just right, turning everything brighter than it should have been, as if the room itself wanted me to see it clearly. Richard was pouring himself coffee, calm, steady, like he had done for the past 42 years of our marriage, like nothing in this house had shifted. I picked up the box, felt its weight, light but deliberate, and asked, as evenly as I could, "When did you get this?" He didn't look at me right away. That was the first thing. Richard had always looked at me. Even in silence. Even in small moments. "Oh, that," he said finally, too quickly, like the answer had been waiting on his tongue before I even spoke. "Must be something you ordered and forgot about." I smiled. Not because I believed him, but because I suddenly understood that whatever this was, it wasn't going to reveal itself in noise. I turned the box over in my hands. No store label. No shipping mark. Just that ribbon, tied carefully, not like something rushed or careless. Someone had taken their time. I set it back down exactly where I found it. "Strange," I said. "I don't remember buying anything." He shrugged. "Too casual. Too light." Then he sipped his coffee, eyes drifting away from me, landing somewhere near the window, as if something outside had suddenly become more interesting than the woman he had spent a lifetime with. That was the second thing. I didn't open the box. Not then. Instead, I wiped the counter with a cloth that didn't need wiping, folded it, placed it beside the sink. Routine. Familiar. Controlled. My hands moved the way they always had. Inside, something had already begun to rearrange itself. Later that evening, when Richard stepped out to take a call he said was just business, I walked back into the kitchen. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock. I picked up the box again, slower this time, like it might tell me something if I listened closely enough. The ribbon slid loose without resistance. Whoever tied it knew it would be opened. I lifted the lid. Inside was a watch. Not new. Not old either. Carefully chosen. Masculine. Elegant. And beneath it, folded neatly, a receipt. I didn't unfold it all the way. I didn't need to. The store name alone was enough. It was a boutique downtown. Small. Private. The kind of place you didn't just walk into unless you already knew what you were looking for. I had never been there. But I had heard of it. From someone who mentioned it once, casually, over dinner, as if it meant nothing. Emily. I closed the box gently, pressing the lid down until it sat perfectly in place again. Then I retied the ribbon, slower than before, making sure every loop looked untouched. When Richard came back inside, I was already sitting at the table, hands folded, just like always. He looked at me, searching for something. Maybe a question. Maybe a reaction. I gave him neither. I only smiled, the same quiet smile I had worn for decades, and for the first time in our marriage, I realized I didn't need him to explain anything at all. I did not mention the watch the next morning, and neither did he. But silence has a way of growing louder when it is shared by two people who both know it should not exist. Richard followed his usual routine, stepping onto the back porch with his coffee at exactly 7:15, checking his phone between sips, his posture relaxed in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. I watched him through the kitchen window as I rinsed the same plate twice, letting the water run longer than necessary, listening not to the sound of it, but to the rhythm of his movements outside. He smiled once, faintly, at something on his screen, and that was the third thing. It was not the smile itself. It was the direction of it. Not toward the house. Not toward me. Somewhere else entirely. I dried my hands and walked to the drawer where we kept the household papers, the ones we never needed until suddenly we did. I opened it slowly, careful not to disturb the neat stacks I had arranged years ago and maintained ever since. Receipts, manuals, old warranties, all lined up like quiet records of a life built on order. I slipped the receipt from the watch box into that drawer, placing it between two documents so it would not curl, so it would remain exactly as I found it, preserved. Evidence, though I had not yet said the word out loud, even in my own mind. Later that afternoon, I drove downtown, taking the longer route, the one that passed the small park where we used to walk when we first moved into this house, back when time felt slower and promises felt permanent. I parked a block away from the boutique, choosing a spot that kept me just out of direct view, then walked the rest of the distance at a pace that would not draw attention. The storefront was exactly as I remembered from the one time it had come up in conversation, understated, almost discreet, the kind of place that did not advertise itself because it did not need to. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and something floral, subtle but deliberate. A young woman greeted me, her smile professional, her tone warm but measured. I returned it with the same calm I had used for decades, the same calm that had carried me through raising children, through loss, through change. I asked about the watch, describing it without hesitation, watching her eyes as she listened. Recognition flickered there, brief but unmistakable. She nodded, just once, then turned to the register, tapping a few keys with quiet efficiency. "Yes," she said, her voice even, "that piece was purchased last week." Last week. I let the words settle, not reacting, not leaning forward, not giving her anything more than polite interest. "It was a gift," she added, as if that clarified everything. I smiled again, the same way I had the night before, and thanked her for her time. I did not ask for a name. I did not need to. Some answers arrive fully formed the moment you stop asking the wrong questions. As I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun felt warmer than it should have, pressing gently against my shoulders, as if urging me forward. I walked to my car, sat inside, and placed both hands on the steering wheel, steady, unmoving. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, I saw my own eyes clearly, sharper than they had been in years. Not hurt. Not confused. Focused. Whatever. It had already begun before I noticed it. And now that I understood something with a clarity that did not need confirmation. I was no longer looking for the truth. I was preparing for what I would do with it. That evening, I made dinner the same way I always had, measuring ingredients without looking, setting the table with the same two plates we had used for years, placing his fork slightly to the left because that was how he preferred it, or at least how he used to. Richard came in just after 6, his footsteps steady, his presence filling the doorway before his voice did. He thanked me for the meal, the same polite tone, the same practiced gratitude, and for a moment, if I had not known what I knew, I might have believed everything was still intact. But I had seen the receipt. I had heard the confirmation. And once something shifts, it does not shift back. We ate in silence for a while, the kind that used to feel comfortable, but now felt measured, like each second was being observed from a distance. He checked his phone again, just once, but it was enough. The fourth thing. He turned the screen slightly away, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I did. I noticed everything now. After dinner, he offered to wash the dishes, which he had not done in months. I let him. I stood by the window again, hands resting lightly on the counter, watching his reflection in the glass rather than turning around. His movements were careful, almost deliberate, as if he was aware of being seen without wanting to acknowledge it. "I might have to go out tomorrow," he said casually, not looking up. "There is something I need to take care of." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the darkening yard outside. "Of course," I replied, my voice steady, unchanged. "You should." He paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough to register surprise, then continued rinsing the plate in his hands. Later that night, after he had gone to bed, I stayed up. The house felt different in the quiet, not heavier, but clearer, as if every object had been placed under a brighter light. I walked into the living room and sat in the chair by the lamp, the one I had chosen years ago because it faced both the door and the window. I picked up my phone and opened the contacts list, scrolling slowly until I found a name I had not needed in a long time. Danielle Harris. Our family attorney. I did not call. Not yet. Instead, I studied the number, letting it sit there on the screen, a reminder that there were steps I could take when I chose to take them. I set the phone down and leaned back, closing my eyes for just a moment. Not to rest, but to think. Every memory from the past few months began to rearrange itself, small details I had dismissed now returning with sharper edges. The late errands. The unexplained purchases. The way Emily had mentioned that boutique so casually, as if it were just another store, as if it held no significance at all. I opened my eyes and looked around the room, at the photographs on the wall, at the life we had built piece by piece, year after year. It was all still there. But it no longer felt the same. Not broken. Not yet. Just different. I stood up slowly and walked back toward the bedroom, stopping briefly in the hallway where the floorboard always creaked under the same step. I avoided it without thinking, the way I always had, the way you learn to move quietly in a house you know by heart. When I reached the doorway, I paused. Richard was asleep, his breathing even, his face relaxed in a way that almost looked familiar. I watched him for a few seconds, then turned away without a word. Back in the hallway, I reached for my phone again, this time not to look, but to act. I opened the calendar and marked a time for the next morning. 10 o'clock. Not for him. For me. Because whatever this was, it was no longer something I needed to understand. It was something I needed to handle. At exactly 10 o'clock the next morning, I was already seated in Danielle Harris's office, my hands resting calmly in my lap as if I were there for something routine, something expected, rather than the quiet unraveling of a life I had trusted for over 4 decades. The office had not changed much since the last time I had visited, the same. Dark wood shelves, the same neatly arranged folders, the same faint scent of paper and coffee lingering in the air. Daniel looked older, of course, just as I did, but his eyes were the same, sharp, attentive, the kind that noticed what was not being said just as much as what was. He greeted me warmly, asked about my health, about Richard, about the house, all the things people ask when they believe everything is still as it should be. I answered simply, politely, giving him nothing more than the surface. Then I reached into my bag and placed the folded receipt on his desk, smoothing it out carefully with the palm of my hand. I did not rush. I did not explain. I let the paper speak first. He glanced down, read the store name, the date, the item, and then looked back up at me, his expression shifting just slightly, enough to tell me he understood this was not a casual visit. I would like to review my financial arrangements, I said, my voice steady, measured, the same tone I had used my entire adult life when making decisions that mattered. He nodded once, leaning back in his chair, giving me the space to continue. Specifically, I added, I would like to ensure that everything in my name remains protected. He did not ask unnecessary questions. That was why we had trusted him all these years. Instead, he began outlining the steps, the documents, the accounts we would need to review, his words precise, efficient, grounded in facts rather than emotion. I listened carefully, absorbing each detail, each option, each quiet safeguard that could be put into place without drawing attention. Outside, through the window, I could see people moving along the sidewalk, their lives continuing without interruption, unaware that in this room, something was being quietly rewritten. When the meeting ended, I stood, thanked him, and scheduled a follow-up for the following week. Nothing urgent. Nothing dramatic. Just a continuation of what had already begun. As I walked back to my car, the air felt cooler than the day before, a light breeze moving through the street, brushing against my face with a kind of clarity I had not noticed in a long time. I drove home without turning on the radio, letting the silence fill the space instead, not heavy, not oppressive, just present. When I pulled into the driveway, Richard's car was gone. Of course it was. He had mentioned needing to go out. I stepped inside the house and paused for a moment in the entryway, taking in the stillness, the familiar arrangement of furniture, the quiet order I had maintained for years. Nothing looked different. And yet, everything felt newly defined. I walked into the bedroom and opened the closet, my gaze moving across his suits, his shirts, each one hanging exactly where it should be. I reached out and adjusted one sleeve, straightening it, not because it needed fixing, but because I wanted to see if my hands would hesitate. They did not. Later, I returned to the kitchen and stood by the counter where the box still sat, untouched, exactly as I had left it. I looked at it for a long moment, then turned away without opening it again. There was no need. Some things, once revealed, do not require repetition. I moved through the house with quiet purpose, making small adjustments, noting details, placing items exactly where they belonged, as if preparing for something that had not yet been announced. By the time Richard returned that evening, I was sitting in the living room, a book open in my hands, my posture relaxed, my expression calm. He greeted me, his voice carrying the same ease, the same familiarity, but now I could hear the space beneath it, the careful distance he believed I could not detect. I looked up, met his eyes, and smiled, not warmly, not coldly, just enough to acknowledge his presence. "How was your day?" I asked. He answered, offering a simple explanation, something about errands, about timing, about nothing in particular. I nodded, listening, letting him speak, giving him the same quiet attention I always had. But this time I was not listening for truth. I was listening for patterns. And slowly, piece by piece, they were beginning to reveal themselves. The next few days settled into a rhythm that felt almost familiar, but only on the surface, like a song playing slightly off-key if you listened closely enough. Richard continued his routines, leaving the house at times he did not use to leave, returning with explanations that were always just complete enough to avoid further questions, yet never detailed enough to feel real. I did not challenge him. I did not interrupt. I simply observed. On Thursday afternoon, Emily stopped by unannounced, her presence filling the doorway with the same easy confidence she had always carried, her smile bright, her tone warm, as if nothing in the world had shifted beneath her feet. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the room for just a second longer than necessary before settling on me. I smiled in return, offering her tea, watching the way her shoulders relaxed slightly, as if reassured by my normalcy. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where countless conversations had unfolded over the years, conversations I now began to replay in my mind with a different lens. She spoke about small things at first, the weather, a new store that had opened downtown, a sale she had found, her voice light, practiced, controlled. Then she mentioned the boutique again, casually, almost as an afterthought, describing a display she had seen, a piece she said would make a perfect gift for someone with classic taste. I nodded, my hands wrapped around the warm cup, letting her words settle into place without reacting. The fifth thing. It was not what she said. It was how easily she said it, how naturally it slipped into conversation, as if she had rehearsed it somewhere before arriving. "You should go sometime," she added, her eyes meeting mine for a brief moment, searching, measuring. I held her gaze just long enough to acknowledge the suggestion, then looked down at my tea. "Perhaps I will," I replied softly. She stayed for less than an hour, finishing her tea, offering a quick embrace before leaving, her perfume lingering faintly in the air after the door closed behind her. I did not move right away. I sat there, listening to the quiet return, the ticking clock, the distant hum of a passing car. Then I stood, walked to the sink, and rinsed the cup she had used, placing it carefully on the rack to dry. Later that evening, Richard returned earlier than usual, his mood lighter, almost relieved, as if something had gone according to plan. He asked about my day, his voice steady, his eyes attentive in a way that might have seemed genuine if I had not already learned to notice the difference between attention and performance. "It was peaceful," I said simply. Watching the way he processed the word, how he nodded, accepting it without probing further. During dinner, he mentioned seeing Emily briefly, his tone casual, his expression neutral, but there was a slight delay before he said her name, just enough to register. I lowered my fork, met his eyes, and smiled gently. "She stopped by," I said, my voice calm, unhurried. He blinked once, a small pause, then recovered quickly, offering a light comment about timing, about coincidence, about nothing in particular. I nodded again, letting the conversation drift to safer topics, allowing him to fill the silence with ordinary details. But inside, everything was aligning with a precision that no longer felt accidental. After dinner, as he settled into his chair, scrolling through his phone with quiet focus, I walked into the hallway and glanced at the calendar on the wall, my eyes landing on the appointment I had marked. It was still there. Unchanged. A small square of ink holding more weight than anything else in the house. I stood there for a moment, then turned away, returning to the living room where Richard sat, unaware that the space between us had already shifted into something neither of us could undo. I picked up my book, opened it to the same page I had not read the night before, and let my eyes rest on the words without truly seeing them. Because now, it was no longer about what I knew. It was about what they believed I did not. On Saturday morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I could not sleep, but because my mind had already moved ahead of the day, arranging pieces that were no longer scattered. The house was still quiet, the kind of quiet that settles before anything begins, and I took my time getting out of bed, folding the blanket neatly, smoothing the edges as I always had, maintaining the same order that had defined my life for years. Richard was still asleep, his back turned, his breathing steady, unaware that the space beside him had already changed in ways he could not yet see. I walked into the kitchen and started the coffee maker, the soft mechanical sound filling the silence, grounding me in routine while everything else shifted beneath it. By the time he came in, I was already seated, a cup in front of me. Untouched. He greeted me with a nod, his voice low, still carrying the weight of sleep, and reached for his own cup without hesitation. "I might step out later," he said, almost immediately, as if the thought had been waiting for the right moment to surface. I looked at him briefly, then back at the table. "Of course," I replied, the same calm tone, the same absence of resistance. He paused, just for a second, then continued, adding a few more details, something about meeting someone, something about timing, but the specifics did not matter anymore. What mattered was the pattern. After he left, I did not clean the kitchen right away. Instead, I walked into the living room and stood near the window, watching as his car disappeared down the street, turning the same corner it always did. I waited a few seconds longer than necessary, then turned away and reached for my phone. This time, I did not hesitate. I called Daniel. His voice was steady, familiar, and when I spoke, I kept my words simple, direct, asking him to move forward with the arrangements we had discussed. He did not ask why. He did not need to. After the call ended, I set the phone down and walked to the hallway closet, opening it slowly, scanning the shelves with a careful eye. I was not looking for anything specific at first, just letting my gaze settle where it needed to, until it stopped. A small box, tucked behind a stack of old files, partially hidden but not entirely. I pulled it forward, feeling its weight, similar to the first one, though slightly heavier. The lid was not tied this time. It opened easily. Inside, there was no watch. Just paper. Folded. Neatly placed. I unfolded it slowly, recognizing the handwriting immediately, the same soft curves, the same deliberate strokes. Emily. The message was brief, but it did not need to be long to say everything it intended to say. It spoke of time, of understanding, of moments shared quietly, carefully, as if written for someone who already knew the rest. I read it once, then again, not searching for meaning, but confirming what had already become clear. When I finished, I folded the paper back along the same lines and returned it to the box, placing everything exactly as I had found it. I closed the closet door gently and stood there for a moment, my hand resting against the wood, steady, unmoving. There was no rush in my breathing, no urgency in my thoughts. Just clarity. Later that afternoon, I sat at the dining table with a notepad in front of me, writing down names, dates, small details that had once seemed unimportant but now formed a sequence I could follow. Each line added another layer, another connection, until the pattern was no longer something I had to think about. It was simply there. When Richard returned that evening, I greeted him the same way I always had, my expression calm, my voice even, offering him the same space to speak, to explain, to continue whatever version of the story he believed was still intact. And as he talked, filling the room with words that no longer carried weight, I listened quietly, not to understand him, but to measure how far he believed he could go before the truth caught up with him. By Sunday evening, the house had settled into a silence that no longer felt accidental, but intentional, as if it were holding something in place until the right moment arrived. I sat in the living room with the lamp on, the same soft light casting familiar shadows across the walls, and listened to Richard moving in the kitchen, opening drawers, closing cabinets, his footsteps measured, predictable. Everything about him was still recognizable. And yet, none of it felt the same. I had placed the second box back exactly where I found it, the note folded along its original lines, the closet door closed with the same quiet care I had used for years. Nothing disturbed. Nothing revealed. That was important. Not for him. For me. Because now, it was no longer about discovering anything new. It was about timing. When he entered the room, he carried 2 glasses of water, offering one to me with a small smile, the kind that used to feel genuine, effortless. I accepted it, my fingers brushing the cool surface of the glass, and thanked him softly. He sat across from me, leaning back slightly, his posture relaxed, as if this moment, like so many others, required nothing more than presence. "Emily mentioned she might stop by again this week," he said, his voice even, his eyes steady, watching me just closely enough to register my reaction. I nodded once, taking a small sip of water before setting the glass down on the table. "She is always welcome," I replied, my tone unchanged, my expression calm. He held my gaze for a second longer than usual, then looked away, shifting slightly in his seat, as if something in my response had not aligned with what he expected. The 6th thing. It was not discomfort. It was uncertainty. Later that night, after he had gone to bed, I returned to the dining table, the notepad still there, the list growing with each passing day. Names. Dates. Places. Small details that now formed a complete picture when placed side by side. I added one more line, the date from the receipt, aligning it with the day Emily had first mentioned the boutique weeks ago, her tone light, her words seemingly casual. It matched. Of course it did. I set the pen down and leaned back in the chair, my eyes moving slowly across the room, taking in everything I had built, everything I had maintained, everything that now stood quietly at the edge of change. There was no anger in me. Not anymore. That had passed somewhere between the moment I saw the handwriting and the moment I understood what it meant. What remained was something steadier. More precise. The next morning, I woke before Richard again, moving through the house with the same quiet efficiency, preparing breakfast, setting the table, maintaining the rhythm he believed had not shifted. When he joined me, he seemed more at ease than he had been in days, his voice lighter, his movements less guarded. "I think we should have everyone over this weekend," he said, almost casually, as if the idea had just occurred to him. "It has been a while." I looked at him, holding his gaze just long enough to see the intention beneath the suggestion, then nodded slowly. "That sounds nice," I said, my voice calm, almost warm. "It has been a while." He smiled, relieved, as if something had fallen back into place. But I knew better. I knew that nothing returns to what it was once it has been seen clearly. And as I cleared the table, placing each dish into the sink with quiet care, I realized that the moment he believed would bring everything together might be the very moment it all came apart. The rest of the week unfolded with a quiet precision that even I had not expected from myself, every detail of the upcoming gathering settling into place as if it had always been meant to happen this way, and by Thursday afternoon, I found myself standing in the grocery store, moving slowly through each aisle, selecting items not just out of habit, but with intention, choosing Richard's favorites. The dishes Emily had once complimented, the desserts that made everything feel familiar and welcoming. Because that was exactly what I needed this to be on the surface, something warm, something unquestionable, something that would never suggest what was quietly waiting underneath it all. When I returned home, I placed everything neatly on the counter, organizing ingredients with the same care I had used for years, and as I worked, I could hear Richard in his office, his voice low, speaking on the phone, the tone careful, measured, the kind of tone that carries more in what it avoids than what it says. I did not move closer. I did not need to. By now, I understood enough without listening to every word. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, he seemed lighter again, almost eager, asking small questions about the menu for the weekend, offering suggestions, even volunteering to help with the setup, which was not something he usually did. I smiled, nodding, allowing him to feel involved, allowing him to believe that this gathering was simply what it appeared to be, a long overdue moment of togetherness. "I think Emily will like that," he said at one point, referring to the dessert I had mentioned, his voice carrying a familiarity that no longer went unnoticed. I held his gaze for a brief moment, then looked down at my plate. "I am sure she will," I replied calmly. On Friday morning, I made a call to Daniel again, confirming the time, the arrangements, and one final detail that I had decided on the night before. He listened carefully, his responses brief but clear, and when the call ended, I felt a sense of completeness that had nothing to do with the house, the food, or the guests. It was something deeper, something settled. Later that afternoon, I took out the small box once more, not to read the note again, but to place it somewhere new, somewhere it would be found at the right moment, without effort, without suspicion, as if it had simply been waiting there all along. I chose the side table in the living room, near the lamp, a place where eyes naturally fall when conversation slows, when silence begins to stretch just enough for someone to notice what is not supposed to be there. I positioned it carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, ensuring that it looked intentional, but not obvious. When Richard came home that evening, he paused briefly when he saw it, his eyes flickering toward it before returning to me. "What is that?" he asked casually, though his tone carried the slightest tension. I glanced at it, then back at him, my expression neutral. "Just something I found while cleaning," I said softly. "I thought I would go through it later." He nodded, too quickly, then looked away, placing his keys on the counter with a little more force than necessary. That was all I needed to see. On Saturday morning, the house was already alive before the first guest arrived, the scent of food filling the air, the table set with care, every detail in place, every chair positioned exactly where it needed to be. Richard moved through the rooms with a restless energy, checking things, adjusting small details, his movements sharper than usual, as if something inside him had not fully settled. When the doorbell finally rang, I took a slow breath, smoothing my hands against the fabric of my dress, and walked to the door with a calm I had not felt in days, knowing that everything from this point forward would unfold exactly as it was meant to, not by chance, but by design. When I opened the door, the familiar smiles and warm greetings filled the space exactly as expected, neighbors, a few close friends, and finally Emily, stepping in with a soft confidence that had once felt natural to me, her presence blending seamlessly into the room as if she belonged there in every sense, and behind her, Richard's expression shifted just slightly, something between relief and anticipation, a quiet signal that did not go unnoticed. I welcomed everyone in, my voice calm, my movements measured, guiding them toward the living room where the table was set and the afternoon light filtered gently through the windows, creating a setting so ordinary it almost felt untouched by anything hidden beneath it. Conversations began easily, laughter rising and falling in soft waves, glasses clinking lightly, the kind of gathering we had hosted many times before, and yet, every moment now carried a different weight for me, every glance, every pause, every small interaction fitting into the pattern I had already seen. Emily moved comfortably through the room, offering compliments on the house, the food, the arrangement, her tone light and appreciative, but there was a subtle awareness in the way she occasionally looked toward Richard, quick, almost imperceptible, but enough. Richard, for his part, maintained a careful balance, engaging with guests, responding to questions, yet always returning, even if only briefly, to where she stood, as if drawn by something he could not fully conceal. I stayed present in every conversation, listening, responding, allowing the gathering to unfold without interruption, because timing was everything now. At one point, as the group settled into the living room, someone commented on how inviting everything felt, how thoughtfully arranged it all was, and I smiled, acknowledging the compliment with a simple nod, my eyes briefly moving to the side table where the small box sat quietly under the lamp, exactly where I had placed it. It did not take long. Emily's gaze followed the same path, her expression shifting just enough to register recognition before she quickly masked it, turning back to the conversation with a practiced ease that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But I saw it. And so did Richard. His posture stiffened for just a second, his hand pausing mid-gesture before he forced himself to continue, his voice steady but slightly strained beneath the surface. The room continued to hum with conversation, but there was now a subtle tension woven into it, something unspoken yet present, like a thread that had been pulled just enough to alter the entire fabric. After a while, as plates were cleared and people shifted seats, Emily found herself closer to the side table, her movements slower, more deliberate, her eyes drawn again to the box, as if resisting the urge to acknowledge it openly. I watched quietly from across the room, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my expression unchanged, allowing the moment to stretch just long enough. Finally, someone asked about it, a simple question, casual, harmless on the surface, pointing toward the box with mild curiosity. "What is that?" the guest asked, smiling lightly. All eyes turned, including Emily's and Richard's, and I let a brief silence settle before answering. "Something I found recently," I said softly, my voice even, carrying just enough clarity to hold everyone's attention. "I have not had the chance to go through it properly yet." The words were simple, but the effect was immediate. Richard shifted in his seat, his gaze fixed on the box, while Emily's composure faltered for the first time, her hand tightening slightly around the glass she held. The room remained quiet for a moment longer than usual, the kind of pause that reveals more than any words could, and as the conversation slowly resumed, I knew that the balance had already begun to tip, not through confrontation, but through something far more precise, the quiet unveiling of what could no longer remain hidden once it had been placed in plain sight. The conversation resumed, but it never fully recovered its earlier rhythm, as if something unseen had shifted the air in the room, making every word just slightly more careful, every laugh just a little delayed, and I allowed it to unfold that way, sitting quietly, observing without drawing attention to myself, because now it was no longer necessary to guide anything directly. The presence of the box had already begun to do that for me. Emily tried to rejoin the flow of conversation, offering a comment here, a polite laugh there, but her focus kept drifting, her eyes returning again and again to the side table, as if the object itself had become impossible to ignore, and each time she looked, Richard noticed, his own gaze following hers before quickly pulling away, the two of them caught in a silent exchange that no one else in the room could fully interpret, but that I understood completely. After a while, one of the guests stood up and moved toward the table, picking up the box with casual curiosity, turning it slightly in their hands as they examined it. "It looks old," they said lightly, glancing toward me. I met their eyes and gave a small nod. "It might be," I replied, my tone calm, almost indifferent. "I have not really gone through it yet." The guest smiled, clearly not expecting anything significant, and began to lift the lid, the motion slow, unhurried, as if it were just another small moment in an otherwise ordinary gathering. But the effect was immediate. Richard shifted forward in his seat, his posture tightening, his hand resting against his knee with a firmness that had not been there before. Emily's breath caught slightly, her shoulders stiffening as she watched, unable to look away this time. The lid opened fully, revealing the folded paper inside, placed neatly, deliberately. The guest reached for it, unfolding it without hesitation, their expression still neutral, unaware of the weight it carried for others in the room. There was a brief silence as their eyes moved across the page, the casual curiosity fading into something more focused, more attentive, as they read the words written in careful, familiar handwriting. "Oh," they said softly, not loudly, but enough for the nearby conversations to quiet, drawing attention toward them. They hesitated, glancing up at me as if unsure whether to continue, and I held their gaze for a moment before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. They read a line aloud, not the entire message, just enough to reveal its tone, its meaning, words that spoke of shared moments, of time spent quietly, of something that was never meant to be seen by anyone else. The room fell into a deeper silence now, one that could not be brushed aside or filled with polite conversation. Richard stood abruptly, his chair moving slightly against the floor, the sound sharper than anything that had come before, his expression controlled but no longer at ease. "That is private," he said, his voice steady but firm, stepping closer to the guest, reaching for the paper. Emily remained seated, her face pale, her composure slipping in a way that could not be disguised anymore, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. I stayed where I was, my posture relaxed, my expression unchanged, watching as everything that had been carefully hidden began to surface without me having to say a single word. The guest handed the paper back without resistance, their earlier curiosity replaced with quiet discomfort, and as Richard folded it quickly, placing it back into the box, the room remained still, every person present now aware that something had shifted beyond the reach of simple explanation. And in that moment, as Richard stood there holding what he could no longer fully conceal, I realized that the truth had already been revealed in the only way it needed to be, not through accusation, not through confrontation, but through the quiet exposure of what had never been meant to be found. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire room had paused in a single breath, waiting for something to be said that could restore what had just been broken, but nothing came, because there was nothing left that could return things to what they had been even minutes before. Richard remained standing, the box in his hands now closed, his fingers resting firmly against its edges as if holding it together might somehow hold everything else in place. His eyes moved across the room, briefly meeting those of the guests, then shifting away, unable to settle anywhere for long. Emily still had not moved, her posture rigid, her gaze lowered now, no longer attempting to follow the conversation that had quietly dissolved around her. I rose slowly from my seat, not with urgency, but with a calm that felt steady and deliberate, and as I walked toward Richard, the soft sound of my steps seemed louder than usual in the silence that had settled. When I reached him, I did not reach for the box immediately. Instead, I looked at him, holding his gaze with a quiet clarity that did not demand anything, but left no room for misunderstanding. "You should let them see it," I said gently, my voice even, carrying across the room without force. The words were simple, but they landed with a weight that could not be ignored. Richard hesitated, his grip tightening slightly, his jaw setting as if he were considering whether there was still a way to control what came next. But there was not. Not anymore. The room remained still, every eye now on him, not with judgment, but with the quiet expectation that follows when something hidden has already begun to surface. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he opened the box again, his movements careful, measured, as if prolonging each second might somehow change the outcome. He unfolded the paper once more, his hand steady but his expression no longer composed, and for a moment, he simply looked at it, as if seeing it differently now that it was no longer just between him and Emily. Then, without speaking, he handed it to the same guest who had read from it before. This time, there was no hesitation. The guest took the paper and read it more clearly, more completely, the words now filling the room without interruption, each line revealing more than the last, not through anything explicit, but through the unmistakable tone of familiarity, of closeness, of something that had been carefully kept separate from everything else. No one spoke while the words were read. No one interrupted. Because by the time the last line was reached, there was no longer any need for explanation. The meaning was already understood. When the paper was lowered, the silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer uncertain. It was final. I stepped back slightly, giving space not just physically, but in a way that allowed the moment to settle fully, without interference. Richard did not look at me immediately. His gaze remained fixed somewhere ahead, as if he were still trying to process how quickly everything had shifted beyond his control. Emily finally lifted her head, her eyes moving toward him, then toward me, her expression no longer guarded, but exposed in a way that could not be hidden behind polite words or careful gestures. I did not say anything more. I did not need to. Because what had been revealed spoke clearly enough on its own, and as I stood there, calm, composed, and completely certain, I understood that this was not about forcing a confession or creating a scene. It was about allowing the truth to exist where it could no longer be denied, in a space where everyone could see it for exactly what it was. No one spoke for several seconds after the final word was read, as if the room itself needed time to settle around a truth that had already taken its place, and in that stillness, something shifted permanently, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone. I remained where I was, my posture relaxed, my breathing steady, watching as each person present adjusted quietly to what they had just witnessed, some lowering their gaze, others glancing toward the door as if instinctively searching for an exit from a moment that no longer felt comfortable to stay inside. Richard finally exhaled, a slow, controlled breath that carried more weight than anything he had said all evening, and when he looked at me, there was no longer any attempt to explain, no effort to reshape what had already been revealed. There was only recognition. Emily stood shortly after, her movements careful, her composure pieced together just enough to carry her through the next few minutes, but the ease she had brought into the house earlier was gone completely, replaced by a quiet tension that followed her as she reached for her bag. No one stopped her. No one needed to. The space between everyone had already widened in a way that made any attempt at normal conversation feel unnecessary. One by one, the guests began to gather their things, offering polite, subdued farewells, their voices softer than when they had arrived, their smiles brief, their eyes avoiding anything that might pull them back into the center of what had just unfolded. I walked each of them to the door with the same calm presence I had maintained throughout the evening, thanking them for coming, my tone steady, unchanged, because this moment was not about them, and it was not about creating discomfort. It was about allowing everything to return to its natural state, without illusion. When the door finally closed and the house fell quiet again, it was a different kind of silence than the one that had existed before, no longer filled with unspoken questions, but with something clearer, something resolved. Richard remained in the living room, the box still resting on the table, his hand no longer holding it, but close enough to suggest he had not fully let go. I walked back into the room slowly and took a seat across from him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "You do not have to say anything," I said gently, my voice calm, not unkind, but firm in its certainty. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement that carried more meaning than any explanation could. There was nothing left to ask. Nothing left to confirm. Because the truth had already done its work. I reached for the box then, closing the lid fully and moving it aside, not with anger, not with finality, but with the quiet understanding that it no longer held any power over what came next. Outside, the evening light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the floor, and as I sat there, I realized that what I felt was not loss, not even relief, but something steadier, something grounded. Clarity. The kind that does not come from confrontation, but from seeing things exactly as they are, without distraction, without denial. And in that clarity, I understood that whatever came after this moment would not be shaped by what had been hidden, but by what had finally been revealed, openly, quietly, and without the need for anything more.